Welcome, Bojo, bienvenue. My name is Nathalie de Rosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. Great pleasure to welcome you here at Massey College for another Walter Gordon Symposium on Public Policy. First, acknowledge that Massey College is built on indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and also the great privilege that we have to be here. We have a special relationship with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we always want to recognize, we're always told to recognize the importance, and particularly today, the importance of the stewardship that we all have on the land, and this is particularly appropriate to do that on this conference. The Walter Gordon Symposium is a bit of a tradition at Massey. It is very much linked to many of the key values of Massey College. It is intergenerational. It is done in cooperation with some senior fellows and junior fellows. It is also interdisciplinary, which is another aspect, a key aspect of our work here. So I'm going to invite Tom Axworthy, who's the Public Policy Chair at Massey College, to give some remarks, and then Carolyn Toohey will follow. But I just want to say, you're always welcome at Massey College. Please come back at time, and other ideas for future conferences are always welcome as well. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nathalie. I'm Tom Axworthy, Public Policy Chair, and I want to begin by thanking the students from Massey and the Munk School who've spent months in organizing this conference. We'll all be enlightened by the panelists that they've attracted. They've worked very hard to have a balance of views, which is very important, and some very distinguished speakers, and we hope for engagement from you, the audience. I wanted just to say a word. This is called the Walter Gordon Symposium, and I want to acknowledge and remind people a little bit about Mr. Gordon. Walter Gordon is a former Minister of Finance, and he showed the excellent judgment by giving me my first job in Ottawa as a researcher and speechwriter. So Mr. Gordon had a tremendous commitment to young people and reform in a variety of areas. He then, after his political career, became a major philanthropist and was very close to Massey College, and therefore created a fund that would encourage students to organize events around important public policy issues. So this conference today is really a reflection of Walter's value system, and he would be delighted, I know, with the quality of the panelists and the quality of the students who learn how to do budgets, attract speakers, deal with all the ins and outs of conference making, sharpen the contradictions. Here today, of course, we've got tremendous energy issues, regional equity. Germany and Europe wants our energy. At the same time, we have report after report, the UN just this week, on the climate crisis ever intensifying. So how, as a society, do we begin to reconcile those imperatives? Very hard to do. Well, this panel today will help us think about that, and that's exactly what Mr. Gordon would have loved. So, thank you for coming. Thanks for the students for doing this. Thanks for the spirit of Walter Gordon, and thanks for Massey College. And now it's my pleasure to Carolyn Toohey, my co-chair, and working with the students from Munk and Massey, and herself, a very distinguished professor of health at the Munk School. Carolyn.
Thanks so much, Tom. And it is a great pleasure for me to bring welcome remarks from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. The two sponsors of this symposium, Massey and Munk, are without a doubt the two places at U of T that are closest to my heart and most central to my intellectual world. So it's always a thrill to see the two come together in the Walter Gordon Symposium. I have the honor of being a distinguished fellow at the Munk School, and I have a long history there that goes back to its predecessor, the School of Public Policy and Governance, or PPG, dating from 2006, and I have an even longer history with Massey. I've been a senior fellow here for more than 30 years. Since 2009, Massey and students at Munk and junior fellows at Massey have partnered to offer the annual Walter Gordon Symposium on Public Policy. To that, it was a Massey-only event, but we're proud to have been associated with it at Munk for that number of years. And it is so fitting that that partnership should be in place. I must say, as a faculty member and fellow at Munk, that Munk students bring more passion and commitment and creativity and sheer energy to questions of pressing issues facing Canada and other nations around the globe than any students I have ever been privileged to teach. And Massey Junior Fellows are, well, the single greatest concentration of sheer intellectual curiosity and heft I think you'll find anywhere on campus. So it's entirely fitting that this partnership should be bringing a symposium such as today's to us. Pressing issue, diverse perspectives, as Tom says. Congratulations to the organizers. It looks to be a wonderful event, and I look forward to learning a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. For those of you who haven't met yet, my name is John Carlo. I'm one of the organizers along with Matthew Funk and Sarah Duodu. Thank you very much to both of their help as well, and to David, Tom, and Carolyn for all your support. I'm a Master of Global Affairs student at the Munk School. I'm also a junior fellow at Massey College, so I greatly benefit from both sides and very appreciative of the sponsorship from both sides today. I'm going to stop talking because I know you want to hear about energy. So I'm going to introduce our first keynote for today, who we're very lucky to have come back to Massey College. He previously was a junior fellow at Massey. Phil DeLuna is he's currently an expert of sustainability at McKinsey and Company, where he executives on decarbonization to enable sustainable, inclusive growth. He's Governor General Gold Medal winning scientist, ranked in the top 0.1% in the world in his field, a mentor at the Creative Destruction Lab, and chair of Carbon Management Canada. Prior to McKinsey, he was the youngest ever director at National Research Council, where he built and led a $57 million R&D program developing technologies to decarbonize Canada. He was a finalist in the 20 million Carbon X Prize and on the founding team of the CERT Systems, a carbon tech startup. He's a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada, an adjunct professor of material science and engineering at U of T, a former member of parliament candidate, Massey College junior fellow, a Globe and Mail Top 50 champ, and Forbes 2030 under 30. Phil DeLuna, thank you.
I always get embarrassed whenever a bio is read. So thank you so much to the organizers and for all of you for being here today. It's wonderful to be back here at Massey College. It wasn't too long that I was in their shoes organizing one of these conferences and feeling nervous and to make sure that I didn't mess up any of my remarks. You did a wonderful job, so thank you. So today I'm going to speak about, is net zero by 2050 possible? And I'll talk about the problem that we face, which we all understand. On the screen are three graphs of three metrics: global temperatures, CO2 emissions, and gross domestic product. Because of industrialization and our ability to create by using fossil fuels, we have built an amazing world. It's true. Life expectancy is higher than it's ever been. Quality of life is higher than it's ever been. But as a consequence of that, we also have emitted an inordinate amount of CO2. If you were to take the graph of CO2 emissions and gross domestic product and then overlay them of each other, do a little statistical analysis, you would have an R-squared of about 0.92. Extremely correlated. And so this is the problem that we have. How do we decouple our economy from the emissions that we produce? So I'd like to actually start with a bit of a history lesson. What you're seeing on the screen right now is an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And on that island are calcified bird droppings and guano. If you open up Google Maps and you look at this island, you'll notice that the United States of America owns it. Why? It's too small to host an airport. It's too small to be a shipping lane. The reason is, at the turn of the last century, people were looking for something else. People were looking for fertilizer. And the only ways to get ammonia for that fertilizer was to mine it or to get it from bird droppings from Pacific islands like this. Entire world economies were built around access to ammonia and nitrogen. If you were an economy and you wanted to feed your people, or if you wanted to build railroads because you needed TNT, the N in that TNT is nitrogen that you had to get from here. So those islands in the Pacific Ocean are owned because there were wars fought for them. At the turn of the century, people weren't hungry for energy, they were simply hungry. That was until two German scientists, Carl Bosch and Fritz Haber, invented something called the HaberBosch process, which ammonia, or takes nitrogen from the air, hydrogen, and then uses a catalyst to create synthetic fertilizer or ammonia from it. Because of this invention, the world population was able to sustain itself and grew to what it is today. Without it, the world population would have plateaued at around 3 billion people, and billions of us would not be around. For their invention, won the Nobel Prize twice. Now, why do I talk about fertilizer, ammonia, bird droppings in the Pacific Ocean? Because this process that has led to so many lives is responsible for 2% of the world's yearly emissions. It's a high temperature, high energy process that produces carbon dioxide. So if you're like me and became a vegetarian, cut your carbon footprint from your diet, you would never even get to complete zero, because the fertilizer used to make the plants that you eat still have some sort of carbon footprint, still have some sort of carbon associated with it. So that begs the question, where do our emissions actually come from? We emit around 39 billion tons, almost 40 billion tons of CO2 yearly. And when we think of clean energy and clean technology, we immediately think of solar cells and wind turbines. Yes, electricity is a big piece, the most important piece, but it only accounts for about a third of the worldwide yearly emissions. The rest come from industry and hard-to-abate sectors, transportation, land use change, agriculture, buildings. Everything that we touch, everything that we need to sustain our life, the materials that make the world that we live in, have some sort of emission associated with them. And Canada's path specifically to net zero is becoming increasingly narrow. Why? Well, first, we actually have a challenge that's unique to our peers. We are starting from a very low line, whereas the United States and the European Union can get to around 42% or almost half of their emission reductions simply from decarbonizing their electricity grid. We already start off with a very high amount of non-carbon emitting sources of electricity, around 82% in Canada. So because of that, we don't have the luxury of just being able to turn off as much coal or as much natural gas, because we're already relatively clean and we have very few emissions. So whereas other countries have lower fruit that they can actually take from, we don't have that luxury. To meet our climate goals, it's going to take us about $400 billion in new capex deployed between now and 2030. It will require a 35% reduction in our emissions. But this isn't all bad news. By investing in this initial capital expenditure, that also means that our operating costs will go down for a few industries. For transportation, industry, buildings, and agriculture, if we invest now, it can actually become cheaper and better for that economy, better for that industry to be less polluting, to remove more CO2. Among that as well is a massive need for labor. We are going to need about 100,000 direct jobs between 2025 and 2040, with a peak of 135,000 jobs yearly needed in order for this transition. Labor is going to be a huge bottleneck, especially as we think about the skilled labor that is needed to have this actually come to pass. So there are four major areas that we need to move as a country in order to meet net zero by 2050. First is power. We need to increase generation 2.5 times and not only generation, but also our grid infrastructure. Second is build. We need to convert over or around 500,000 buildings into net zero buildings. And this is a massive transformation from a perspective of energy management and heat pumps instead of using natural gas boilers. Transportation and mobility. All sales need to be EVs by 2025 in order for us to actually have the 45% reduction by 2030. So a lot of the projections that we've made so far are highly, highly conservative. And then finally, carbon capture. CCS, carbon capture and storage, needs to equate to more than 200 million tons of CO2 in capacity per year, 30 times today's current capacity, and Canada alone. So that begs the question, can we fully decarbonize our economy, not only in Canada, but in the world? And of course, I'm an optimist, so my answer is yes. I have a 5-point plan. The first step is to protect what we have. Land use change and a lot of the natural carbon sinks that are at risk are because of economic activity that we simply don't need to do. We need to stop clearing away the I just got a little bit, apologies for a moment there. I got a little bit startled by seeing my own face on the screen. I'm like, wow, is that what I look like? So we have to protect what we have. A lot of the CO2 emissions that come from clearing the Amazon rainforest and make room for cattle so that we can make more meat does not need to happen. A lot of the old growth in Western Canada that is being taken down. And old growth is particularly important because those are thousands of years worth of carbon emissions that have been stored and are very difficult to then regrow. So first step, protect what we have. Step 2, renewables everywhere. We know that solar, wind is now cheaper than every other form of electricity generation in many jurisdictions around the world. So we absolutely need to build renewables faster than anywhere else. The biggest limitations of that will be our electricity grids, which may not necessarily be up to par to take all those renewables. And second, intermittency. What do we do when the sun does not shine, wind does not blow? When we're all at home at night watching Netflix and we need electricity, that's why we need long-duration energy storage technologies. And that will be a way for us to level out the grid more. Once we have those green electrons and we've been able to take care of electricity, that third of all CO2 emissions yearly, we need to electrify everything as much as we can. That's already happening with electric vehicles and forms like electric heat pumps, like I mentioned before. So we can use these green electrons to power our world and then rethink about all of the processes that currently use fossil fuels. Once we do that, step 4, there are many different sectors, many different processes that are difficult or impossible to electrify. Take cement production, for example. Cement emits CO2 not from the burning of natural gas for energy to fuel the process, but from the actual chemical process of cement hardening. It's chemistry. It emits CO2 just from the very form of it being made. So how do we address these hard-to-abate sectors? We have to completely revolutionize the way we make these materials, the way that we address and do these sectors today. And then once we've taken care of all of that, we need to capture carbon from the atmosphere. Even if we were to get to 100% renewables tomorrow, if I were able to snap my fingers, even if we were able to take care of all of the hard-to-abate emissions, there would still be legacy emissions. There would still be emissions that we have to take care of. And for that, we have to actually go net negative and take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We know we need transformative technology in order to do this. The International Energy Agency did a report in 2020 called Energy Pathways, where they looked at over 600 technology pathways for us to get to net zero. And they found that almost half of the emission reductions needed for 2050 rely on technologies that are not yet commercial. They either exist at the lab, they're in prototypes, they're in development, but you can't buy them off the shelf. They also found the massive scale of deployment we need to do. We need to build the world's largest solar park every 2 days between now and 2050. We need to build the world's largest electrolyzer to make clean hydrogen every hour. We need to build the world's largest carbon capture facility that exists every single week in order for us to reach our net zero goals. And at every step of this process, it's an exponential cost. What may cost $10,000 in a laboratory to develop a new battery material will cost $100,000 to put it into a battery pack, will cost $1 million to prototype it and demonstrate, will cost $10 million to build the supply chain for those first orders, will cost $100 to get it to scale. And many companies go through this process, and at every step between laboratory to prototype to demonstration, early adoption, there is a valley of death that they never pass. Tesla was unprofitable for 10 years. Only recently were they able to actually create a profit and are starting to recoup all of the investment. That's the scale that we need to look at. If we look at how technologies are developed, we can actually find that from bench to mass market of various technologies, it takes much more time than we think. The car was invented around 1880, and it took 70 years from invention to mass adoption. The cathode ray TV took 44 years. When we advance in technology and we get smarter and we do things better, especially for things that already exist, we can get faster at making the new thing. The mobile telephone only took 29 years. The LCD TV, which was an iteration of the cathode ray TV, only took 20 years, half the time. These are consumer goods that are mass manufacturable. They're easy to scale. Clean energy technologies still take half a lifetime. Nuclear power took 40 years from discovery and invention to mass adoption. Solar, 55 years. Wind, 40 years. We don't have half a lifetime to get to 2050. We have less than 30 years. And so we have to accelerate the way that we create new technologies. One piece that I wanted to talk about really briefly, the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act is a monumental investment in clean energy technologies, and how this investment will help to accelerate all of that development that I showed in the previous slide. We are talking about close to $415 billion in climate spending across 6 key segments, with a 40% reduction in U.S. GHG emissions by 2030. That is massive. Canada has nowhere near the amount of firepower to be able to address this. So how do we compete? To put this into perspective, let's take one example, hydrogen. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act will move the use cases for many different applications: forklifts, city buses, heavy-duty trucks, container ships, biorefineries, ammonia, synthetic fuel production, power generation, gas blending. All of these were thought of being commercial and available from a business case perspective between 2030 and 2040, and now they will all likely become break even in terms of an economic perspective by around 2025. That acceleration of 10 years is exactly what we need in order to address the problem of how do you go from invention to innovation to mass market? How do you go from the bench to the marketplace and a product? Same thing for CCUS. The 45Q tax credit puts many different emission point sources: gas, ethanol, hydrogen, ammonia, power generation, steel, cement, those exact hard-to-abate industries that are difficult to electrify. They are the ones that are actually in the money now because of the investment tax credits that the U.S. has actually put forward. And so I'll end this off with a note, which is that saving the world relies on more than just technology. In my view, there are 3 levers that need to be pulled simultaneously: technology, policy, and finance. And technology, in many ways, is the easiest thing. It either works or it doesn't work. You give it enough time, enough money, enough smart people, and you can accomplish anything. You can get to the moon. You can get to Mars. But the other 2 things, policy and finance, are more difficult, much more challenging, because they rely on soft and hard influence, macroeconomic factors that we cannot control or anticipate. Inflation, war. So how do we tackle that? To me, that's the biggest question of unlocking finance and making sure that policy is aligned to enable the technology development that we need to act in net zero. And so that's what I've been doing so far, is trying to look at each of these different pieces. Technology in academia, policy in the public sector, and now in the private sector working at McKinsey on finance and how to make these things go. And I think this archetype of trying to work across these different sectors, trying to pull these three levers seriously, using the expertise that you've gained from these different areas, is the way of the future. That's how we're going to be able to address these issues. Climate change, energy, world security, these are so complex that we can no longer work in our silos. We have to break down barriers and we have to talk to one another. People that we don't normally talk to and have conversations that we don't normally have. So what can we do to accelerate the climate tech industry in Canada? What can we do to get to net zero? Is to break down the barriers between technology, policy, and finance. To start having these conversations with one another so that we can work in tandem rather than against the goals that we need to do to get to net zero. Thank you. Okay, sure. I have 5 minutes to take Q&A if anyone has a question.
So you mentioned that the cement industry is really hard to get out of the emissions. I heard about this new, I guess, innovation about mycelium bricks, and they're stronger than concrete.
Mhm.
And why isn't the government saying, you know what, this is where we need to move, get out of concrete, and this is more
Yeah.
sustainable?
So the question is about alternatives to concrete and new building materials. Mycelium was proposed, which is actually building materials based off of mushrooms. The issue with any new building material, whether it's mycelium or something else, isn't actually in the tree or the adoption of the technology, but it's in the policy. It's in the safety codes and the regulations. So permitting, and especially when you're trying to adopt new technology in construction, is notoriously difficult because every single jurisdiction has its own nuances, building codes, and testing that they need to do. So in order for something to be mass adopted, like for example, a new alternative to cement, not only does it have safety standards and emission standards, but it has to do that in every single jurisdiction. So the path to market is much more difficult, and the cost to get that and do that in every jurisdiction is hard. That's why people are looking more at new technologies to decarbonize cement, because people know cement, supply chains exist, and it's permitted. However, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to find new materials. It's more that does the cost benefit and the emissions benefit of completely revamping our permitting system make the sense for that new material?
Very impressive start to the conference. You mentioned at the end, very big challenge to integrate technology and finance and public policy.
Mm-hmm.
Easy to say, very hard to do.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, comparatively, who in the world is doing better than Canada in that integration? In a comparative way, who should we be looking at?
It's a really good question, and I'll answer this in a few ways. The first is, I actually think that from the perspective of new energy technology, the provinces have all of the jurisdiction. And yes, while the government can put a price on carbon, as they like to call it, and these other environmental measures in, really where the rubber hits the road are the provinces. And so I'll give you an example. Alberta actually has some of the best policies and permitting for carbon capture and storage. In the United States, the EPA has something called the Class 6 a well permit, which is a permit that allows folks to store gaseous CO2 underground. It is extremely long in order to get that to happen. The EPA don't have enough people in order to issue these permits. And the world is actually looking at Alberta as an example of a regulatory scheme that allows for environmental security as well as a fast path to market for carbon capture technologies. There are other areas where, for example, in Europe, United States, I gave the example of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. There's often that saying that you can count on the U.S. to try everything or do nothing until it's too late and then they finally do the right thing. And it seems to be the case because the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act is a broad-based incentive that really brings forward to the market confidence that if you invest in these technologies, there will be an offtake. The biggest issue with many of these new technologies being commercialized is that people don't want to invest in them because they're worried of uncertainty in terms of whether there'll be a regulatory approval or not, or whether there will actually be a market. The US IRA acknowledges that a lot of these policy issues with the regulatory approval will be very difficult to handle. So let's put an incentive instead that will give investors confidence in long-term offtakes and an economic business case. So I think those are a couple of examples that highlight where we can learn, but also where we have to offer the world in terms of policy.
I want to make a pitch for Carbon Management Canada, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the facility that you have in Newell County in Alberta. But the question that I have is about the adoption of such technologies in countries like the largest emitters, India and China, where their GDP per capita is perhaps a fifth or a quarter of that of the United States. Can they afford the kinds of technologies that are being developed under the IRA? And if not, what is the policy process by which you move or transfer that technology to countries that really need it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, I appreciate the shout out to Carbon Management Canada. So for those who aren't aware, it's a nonprofit carbon tech organization, which I am the chair on the board of directors for. It's based in Alberta, and it runs a research facility that looks at new technologies for shallow storage, monitoring, measurement, verification, which is a big unlock in that space. You raise a really good point, and you mentioned China and India, but I'll also mention developing economies that, like for example, in the African continent, that don't necessarily have the resources to develop the technologies that we do. And in my view, it is incumbent upon Western democracies and Western advanced nations who have benefited and profited from emissions and fossil fuels and the Industrial Revolution to take that upfront of new technologies and allow it to move down the cost curve and scale. Every new technology always costs more in the beginning because we don't know yet how to scale it. There are still learnings. We learn after every iteration. After every solar cell that's made, we know how to make it better. What the Western world should and must do is take the bill for developing these new technologies first, so that they come down the cost curve fast enough that developing economies can then leapfrog existing technologies. They don't have to go through fossil fuel-based economies. I'll give you an example. In Africa, most of the major banking is done using cell phones. And most of the major banking is done using distributed networks of apps, not order institutions. There are so many examples of microgrids that are being built in Africa now because they don't have the oil and gas and fossil fuel infrastructure that already has to be amortized over time. They don't need to have to necessarily worry about recouping investment on infrastructure they've already built. They can leapfrog all of that. So you bring a question about how do we support that transition in developing economies, or those who aren't as fortunate as us. Lots of folks talk about climate reparations, and I think that's absolutely needed from the perspective of mitigation and having to deal with climate risk after they've already been devastated by climate events. Money needs to be there to help people live, survive the climate apocalypse, in my view. But from the technology perspective, we have a responsibility to develop and bring down the cost of technology so that they don't have to. And then the ways that we can do that is either through sharing intellectual property, through at cost scale of technology in these new places, and through training a specifically labor force so that they'll be able to do this faster and more efficiently. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. I actually feel it's quite hopeful, which is always nice to talk about climate. One thing I felt was missing, and you see this a lot, it's like the picture of Teslas, and it's like, this is amazing, finally, it's here. But I wonder to what extent it's a bit of a false solution, because it still requires perpetuating the sort of like single owner individual transport with this infrastructure grid that relies on highways and roads. And your presentation didn't really seem to address these sort of cultural problems in the future. Rice is another great example.
Mm-hmm.
And to what extent are different jurisdictions even thinking about how to go around these, maybe the most intractable problem, which is actual cultural change?
Yeah, it's a great question. So climate is a really politically charged topic, of course, and culturally there are a few elements to that. on one side, there's the subject and topic of climate equity and climate justice in general. Who gets the benefit? Who gets to profit from these new technologies, from decarbonization? Especially when you look at, for example, incentives for electric vehicles, often it's those who have lots of money who can afford electric vehicles who get these incentives. But the folks who are lower income, who live in urban centers, who don't need to drive as much, don't have that opportunity to benefit from many of these incentives. So there is absolutely a place for policy to address that inequality in how we support technologies. We use Tesla as an example for distributed transportation and mobility. The reality is North America is a car-centric economy, a car-centric world. Infrastructure is built around that. That doesn't mean we can't change it, especially in urban centers. Mike, for example, it gave a wonderful policy proposal of 15-minute cities during the last provincial campaign, which, in my view, is what we need to do in urban centers. Get where you need to go, have everything that you need within 15 minutes. And we can do that. We can change bylaws, zoning rights, we can do that. So that's less of a technology problem than it is a policy problem. And my background is, and the work that I do is mainly in technology. There also is the question of, the politically charged notion of a just transition. And what happens to the folks who are working in these heavy emission and oil and gas or automotive sectors whose live jobs may be at stake? And I grew up in Windsor, Ontario. My dad was an auto worker. In 2008, he was laid off when the auto sector collapsed. He has been bouncing around from factory job to factory job since. So I know exactly what it's like to live in a community where everyone is dependent on one industry and what happens when that industry fades away. However, if you look today, the resurgence in Southwestern Ontario automotive because of electric vehicle manufacturing. Stellantis and LG announced an electric vehicle battery plant in Windsor. And the reason they did that there is because of the existing labor force that worked primarily in internal combustion engine manufacture. So there is a use case of how we can find a clean energy destination and a job market for these people to transition to. When I think of the oil and gas sector and I think of our friends in Western Canada, I think of biorefineries and carbon capture and geothermal and all of these other heavy-duty emission technologies that move that need pipe makers and people who understand thermodynamics and fluid mechanics. People who work in the oil and gas sector have all of the skills that we need to transition to an energy secure and sustainable future. The question is, how can we create that pathway? How can we make it more apparent, especially in the oil and gas sector, which is a very boom and bust cycle? When you move into a sustainable economy, that is consistent and stable. So how do we, as a society and as a government, a people, etc., create that pathway for transition to be fair and equitable and just?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phil. We're going to move into our first panel. So I'm going to introduce our moderator for the first panel. Before I do that, I'll just let you know, if you want to ask questions for throughout the day, you're happy to use if you're happy to use the mic in the middle, you can. We're also going to walk around with cue cards and pencils. And if you'd like one, we'll just pass it over to you. And if you have a question that you've written down that you want to get back up to the moderator, just hold it in the air. One of us will walk around. We'll grab it. It gets up to the moderators. So whatever you feel most comfortable with. You can keep the pencil if you'd like. We got a lot of pencils, so there's one for everyone. Yeah, you don't have to share. I know. Yeah, no eraser. So yeah, no, exactly. Alrighty. So I'm gonna introduce our first moderator, who we're so lucky to have join us today. Mike is the leader of the Green Party of Ontario. And he became Ontario's first Green MPP when he was elected to represent the riding of Guelph in 2018. The leader of Ontario Greens for more than a decade, Mike is known as Queen's Park as a champion for climate action, affordable housing, local food and water initiatives, protecting Ontario's farmland and green spaces, supporting frontline healthcare workers and small business. He was re-elected in 2022 with an increased majority. Mike, his wife Sandy, and their 2 daughters like to spend their free time hiking, cycling, and staying active in the community. Thanks very much, Mike. I'll leave it up to you.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction. And I just want to say it's so exciting to be here today for a number of reasons. One of them is that I've had the opportunity to participate in a few events with Munk students over the last couple months, and I will say that our future is secure and bright, given the quality of students we have at the Munk Center. And I also just want to say really quick shout out to Nathalie Rosiers here at Massey. There's Nathalie. Nathalie was my seatmate when I was first elected at Queen's Park. So everything I've been able to accomplish there, I was tutored an excellent MPP. So it's good to be here at Massey. And I'm going to introduce our panelists. And then because one of them can't make it today, and I'm going to tell you why, I think I'll take the seat if that's okay. So I will start with Aaron Colle, who is the president and CEO of Advanced Symbiotics, a company that uses artificial intelligence to improve market research and polling accuracy. If you ever watch TVO, you probably see Steve Paikin interviewing Aaron about Poly, giving predictions on elections and other things. And unfortunately, Aaron is a tragedy of Joe Biden's visit to Canada because the streets in Ottawa were closed and she wasn't able to get to the airport to make her flight to be here today. So unfortunately, we're not going to have her wisdom, but I guess that leaves our other 2 panelists a little extra time. And so I'm just going to say on my far left is Brad Dogood. And Brad retired from public office following a highly successful 30-year political career in 2018. So there is life after politics. That's good to know, Brad. Brad served as a city councillor in the City of Toronto Council for 9 years. Then he went on to serve as MPP for Scarborough Centre at Queen's Park for close to 15 years, holding numerous cabinet positions, including Minister of Labour, Aboriginal Affairs, Infrastructure, Research and Innovation, Energy, Training Colleges and Universities, and Economic Development. As Minister of Economic Development, Brad led the efforts to create a new development strategy to make Ontario a leader in the new economy, which is very relevant to our discussion today. He also led the national negotiations that resulted in the new Canada Free Trade Agreement, the most ambitious external or internal free trade initiative in Canadian history. Brad has been recognized for lifetime achievements in reducing regulatory burden and red tape for businesses. He led to rehabilitate Mars and develop Ontario's first official long-term energy plan. His work in partnership with Indigenous leaders and communities significantly improved relations with Indigenous people in Ontario. Brad now works as a consultant in the private sector. Welcome.
That's the longest bio.
I know. If you're anything like me, reading long bio, please shorten it. And then next to Brad is Fiona Blunden. Fiona is a highly motivated and senior engagement advisor and member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation of the Northwest Territories. Presently, Fiona is leading her expertise in support of active Indigenous participation in major resource and power structure development in Ontario. She serves as the Director of Indigenous Strategy at the Cambridge-based Cormorant Utility Services and was appointed in September 2021 to the Board of Directors of KWG Resources, an exploration stage company participating in the discovery, delineation, and development of chromite deposits in the James Bay lands of Northern Ontario. With over 25 years of combined experience in mining, the public sector, and private consulting for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities, Fiona brings a wealth of experience and understanding, knowing that the best path forward in projects involving Indigenous communities is truly understanding and supporting the unique and vision for respective Indigenous groups. And I just want to say, given the conversation about the Ring of Fire and mining the EV strategy, very, very timely to have you here today, Fiona. I'm going to let both of you, I think we'll start with you, Brad, and then go to Fiona. You have about 10 or 15 minutes. I have the clock here. I'm not gonna be the speaker, so I won't be too strict with the time, but I may tap the floor or something if you're starting to go over.
Great to see you.
Great. Likewise.
Thank you, Mike, for that. And I apologize for the length of that bio. I feel really at home here. I mean, I'm here. I feel like I'm back in the legislature. There's a lot of colleagues here. Dwight Duncan over there in the corner, and a lot of what I speak to, I think Dwight will relate to. We served as energy ministers. I think you served a fair bit longer and during a very challenging time when you were energy minister. I had a challenging time as well, but it was for different reasons. And I think throughout the day, you'll probably get those experience. And Nathalie, it's so good to see you again, former colleague in the legislature. And Mike, you're still going, man. Still doing it. So thank you for the work that you're doing. You're doing great work there. And man, he would have looked good, Dwight, in one of our cabinets as environment minister, wouldn't he have? Not to be, I guess. Well, I'm delighted to be here today, and most of you don't know, and it wasn't in my bio, probably, but you didn't want to make it any longer. I'm also a member of the Quadrangle Society here at Massey, and I got to tell you, I'm like a working class kid from Scarborough. So when I was first approached as to whether I wanted to join this Quadrangle Society, I kind of thought that sounded like something out of Dead Poets Society. And you know, I went to U of T, but I spent all my time out at Scarborough campus, so I was hardly what you would call like the cultural academic type. So I'm kind of thinking, what is this thing? It sounds kind of bizarre. It doesn't sound like a good fit for a kid from Scarborough. But then I knew Nathalie was the principal here, and Nathalie I've known for a long time, and to be honest, one of the nicest and brightest people I've ever met in my life. So surely Nathalie wouldn't steer me wrong. And then the young fella that nominated me was a guy named David Hossenhead, I believe his name is. Hollingshead. I think he was from Scarborough. And I didn't run into him at a philharmonic or a poetry reading or a swanky dinner. Believe it or not, I ran into him at a Tried concert at Casino-Rama after having consumed probably a few too many beers. And actually, I think my friend Wayne Prue from Rosiers was with me that night. And that's where it all got started. So strange things happen in strange places sometimes. And here I am at Massey, and it's nothing like the Dead Poets Society thing that I thought it might be. It's actually quite to be here in this wonderful building with all these wonderful, bright future leaders that are here with us today. So there's no way I could have said no. I want to begin by saying that just about everything I share with you today will really hinge on really what Fiona is going to talk about after me. Fiona and I have known each other a long time. We work at Cormorant together. To be honest, everything that comes forward, or almost everything, if we're going to be successful at, is going to have to be Indigenous, not just engaged, but Indigenous-led. And having served as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, it was called at the time, before I was Energy Minister, and Dwight and I had this discussion earlier on, there's no question that if we're going to succeed, and most of what we're trying to accomplish, it'll have to be Indigenous-led. And I don't want to say too much more about it because I'll steal Fiona's thunder, but I think that's a good place for us to be. I want to start off right at the top by stating something that might be my headline quote. I like to do that sometimes. Just say something right off the top that I think is really relevant. And I think that the previous speakers had kind of alliterated or really referred to this a little bit. We're headed towards an energy crisis in this province again. Dwight was probably the last minister to kind of face an energy crisis when he was energy minister, but we're heading towards that again if we don't move very, very quickly, start making some key decisions to try to address some of those challenges. Like I said, I'll leave it to Fiona to talk a little bit more about the Indigenous side, but I think that global leaders today, for some reason, haven't really been talking too much about this issue. And it's why I'm so happy to be here at Massey raising these issues today, because they're not on the front pages of the paper anymore. They were at one time, but they're not anymore. We really need to have some really smart discussions about where we go with our energy systems going forward. The good news is Ontario was one of the first jurisdictions, frankly, in North America, anywhere in the world, to wean ourselves off of dirty coal. It's something that Dwight and I, as former ministers, take a lot of pride in, because we were there during those days. It wasn't easy. It was a hard thing to do. It was a smart thing to do. And that set us up in a pretty good way. We have now one of the cleanest power systems in North America. It's a good place to start. Smog days are more or less a thing of the past in Toronto as a result of that. So we've all benefited from that. And finally, embracing decarbonization. Industry, building, heating, and transportation are all transitioning towards electrification. And Ontario's transition to electrification will thank God, be powered by mostly clean power. And I think at a certain point, we may need to call out other jurisdictions that are talking about their progress of electrification if they're powering that electrification on dirty coal or other dirtier sources of power, because that's kind of defeating the purpose, isn't it? I mean, you're decarbonizing by electrifying, but then you're contributing again to global warming through the power sources you're using. So I think that's something we've got to keep in mind. We're fortunate to be in a position where we'd be one of those jurisdictions. It'd be nice if I could say that the story ends there. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. The decarbonization is something that's coming. I think the previous speakers have spoken to that. It'll be nice that our EVs will be powered by clean power, no question. Where decarbonization's happening in industry. I see that in the work that we do. We see it happening in mining. We see it happening as companies are moving from oil, gas, diesel-fueled power to electrification. From mining to steel to manufacturing. All of these industries are spending a lot of money right now in that transition phase. We see it happening in transportation, buses, trains, cars. And the auto transition is happening. We don't know exactly when it's going to kick in, but it's coming. There's no question. EVs are growing. Regulations are advancing that. The cost of EVs are no longer the barrier they once were. In fact, I think they're very closely moving into a positive on the cost basis. Range anxiety will soon be addressed by the technology. We're really getting close to that where the dam is going to break and EVs are going to explode on the market, as happens with new technology. And this, I believe, is where the crisis will be upon us. The demand for our power systems in Ontario are going to far exceed the supply of available power. Some have said that our power demand will double. Some have said we'll need 20 to 50 more megawatts of. I don't think anybody really knows at this point in time, but we've got to start planning for it. The fact of the matter is we're not going to have enough power to meet demand, and no energy minister has had to be there since Dwight Duncan was Minister of Energy when he took over a number of years ago. And I won't say how long ago that was, Dwight. I'll leave that to you in your keynote. But it was some time ago. There's simply not enough power to meet demand. And our system's not going to be smart enough to be able to deal with this unless we start acting soon, unless we start acting now. We know this is coming. And I often ask the question, where is the dialogue on this? Because I haven't seen it. Energy was front page news years ago. It's kind of gone off the front page of the paper these days. Where are the long-term energy plans that we once had in Ontario and other jurisdictions across the country? They're tough to do, but it's important that we know where we're going and we know how we're going to address some of these challenges. And I think about it. What a shame it would be if consumers are ready to make the transition to EVs. Industry has invested billions of dollars in the transfer to decarbonization, and we're not going to have enough power to let them do it. So we're going to have to delay our decarbonization efforts as a province and as a country until we can get our power system ready to be able to deal with the fact that we're going to have a good part of the population driving home in electric vehicles at night and plugging in at about the same time. So that's the challenge in front of us. And it's really important that we start thinking about these things and start thinking about the mix of policies we're going to have to come forward with, which is all the more reason why this conference is so relevant today. Now, I could sit and talk about all the ideas, all the things I think we need to be doing, and I'm not going to have time to do that because give a former politician I'm starting to get close to my time. But let me very quickly rattle off 7 or 8 things that I think are going to be very important. I won't go into the details. We'll leave that for the Q&A perhaps. More renewables, more storage, more transmission and distribution, nuclear. We can't, that's debate. That's always a good debate, but I think it's going to be hard for us to get there without it. Innovation, digitalization and innovation. We're not as smart as we think we are in our energy system. We haven't made those investments like we need to be making in innovation. Access to precious metals, which was mentioned, and indigenous-led initiatives. Those are the 8 things I think that we'll need to focus on, and I look forward to having a further conversation about some of those items. I'm going to say one thing, and we can be partisan. We can look at current governments and that kind of thing, and Dwight's not a partisan guy, and Nathalie never was, and neither was I. So we don't really look through that lens, and frankly, neither is Mike. We look for solutions. We know how difficult it is to be Minister of Energy during challenging times. It is difficult. Getting the courage publicly to make some of the decisions that you have to make, which might mean significant investments in power, is very difficult to do. And it's just simple. I mean, Dwight and I are one of 39 people to ever serve as Minister of Energy. I can tell you, toughest job I've ever had in my life, in and out of government. I don't know if Dwight will agree. He was finance minister, so it could be debatable. Very tough, because the fact of the matter is, people want a clean, reliable energy system. They just don't want to pay for it. It is very difficult for governments to raise energy rates. I remember as Minister of Energy putting up rates by 4 cents, not 4%, 4 cents to go towards conservation initiatives. I got skewered. We did it, but I got skewered. I remember being hammered daily in question period every time a rate increase happened. Even though it was all going towards rebuilding our system, all going towards building a cleaner, more reliable system, we could justify it all. But man, it was the toughest job I ever had. So no matter what the political stripe, whoever's in office, I think we all have to try to help govern in many ways as members of the public in giving them support when they make those tough, challenging decisions. And my hope is that over time, we'll be able to encourage this government and others to move forward with long-term energy plans to address some of these challenges. I see you getting restless, Mike. I've got a ton more I want to talk about, but I'm gonna leave you with this, because I think there's a lot we can be doing. I think we can get to where we need to go. But I'll leave you with the last line in Dead Poets Society, spoken by Robin Williams. You know it, where he said, "Carpe diem." And I don't speak Latin. I'm from Scarborough. We don't speak Latin. Seize the day, and stay we must. Thank you very much.
Good timing is good.
I don't trust myself on that stuff.
Don't have a big clock to look at, right?
Good morning, everybody. Massey Cho for having me here today. I'm honored to be participating in the conference today. I'm to be with such esteemed colleagues and friends. And truly, I was thinking about what my comments would be. How do I share with such esteemed people? And what is the unique vision and unique perspective that I bring to what we're talking about today? And I was actually listening to the questions earlier, and I liked a word there, hopeful. I'm hopeful. I'm inspired. I'm focused. I'm practical. And I'm thoughtful about energy. I'm both an Indigenous woman, coming from a community in Northwest Territories. I'm a member of the Yellowknives First Nations. I'm a mother of 3 children and 2 grandchildren. My people tend to think generationally. We tend to think in the long term. I'm an energy executive, at the C-suite level here in Ontario. And I often find that in the meetings that I partake in, I'm often the only Indigenous person and the only woman in many rooms. And I think about how transformative that is, and I often think about how lonely I am as well in that transformation. As a 51-year-old woman, I think of myself still to this day as an activist. Still to this day, I think about what I can change. And the heart of who I was as a young person, I still embody inside. I think about the structural change. I think about, how do I recreate the vision? I grew up as the first generation that didn't go to residential school. And within one generation, we are now owning power assets. And what does that mean for our communities? What does that mean for our country? Because I'm also a Canadian. And I think as a leader, both for my own people and as a leader for other Canadians and a leader in energy. And all of those different pieces come together inside of me. I work at Cormorant Utility Services. We design, build, transmission and distribution. We do O&M work in the province. Last year, our company represented 50% of Hydro One's Indigenous partnerships, our single company. We undertake O&M work in the province, and we handle about 70% of all of the wind farms in O&M in the province of Ontario. There was a reason why I chose to work at Cormorant Utility. We're also owned by John Risley, who sold Clearwater Seafoods last year for approximately $1 billion. And he sold to Premium Brands Holding, and he sold to 7 Mi'kmaq communities, creating the largest single transaction that created Indigenous global shareholders representing Canada on the Indigenous market, on the global markets. Not only were we business people, we were the right partners who had a long-term vision for Clearwater around sustainability in the environment, around the people that had committed decades of their life to Clearwater and to that specific region, and around the jobs derived in that region, and also the good business people bring in the focus that we bring for that region. I thought that was transformative in the thinking when you think about sustainability and you think about innovation from the private sector. John had a vision when he thought about Indigenous people as good partners. And when Cormorant Utility Services started, he amalgamated about 4 companies to create the company because he had a vision that said Indigenous people own the land that electrification is about to be built on. And I share that because I was thoughtful about the keynote speaker, and I really enjoyed, I don't know where he is, but I really enjoyed his presentation. And I thought to myself about public policy, technology, finance, and the land. Right? The land where so much new electrification, clean energy projects, battery storage is about to be built on. The land that Indigenous people either are on, close to, or are their traditional lands. And we think about when you think about critical minerals, think about mining, when you think about oil and gas, when you think about new transmission, you think about the impact that that's going to make for Indigenous people and our impact on electrification. Oftentimes that's the next step in our thinking that we're not even talking about. We're not even talking about battery storage and its impact. And recently, the battery storage at Oneida Battery Storage out of Six Nations, right on a reserve, on the largest reserve in Canada, with 17,000 members still living in that community. The impact that we're having on electrification, transformative. Hydro One recently made an announcement approximately 4 months ago that said every single transmission line in Ontario over $100 million will have the potential to be 50% Indigenous owned. And it's easy to use those words until you really think about what that means. Those are not empty words. That's transformative in our access to finance. It's transformative impact in public policy. It's transformative in economic reconciliation for Indigenous nations. It's transformative in our position with Canadians and as Canadians. It's transformative in Ontario and how Ontario is leading that new financial formula around ownership. And, as a young woman growing up in a remote community, ownership was not even something I could have ever foreseen. We couldn't even own our house, right? My father-in-law, who came from Italy, could vote before my grandfather could in Canada, let alone ownership. And I often think about the transformation around the electrification and the sector around energy. What makes us the right partners is we own the land, and we're stewards of the land. And you know what? We have so much planning around electrification that takes so long, and I have such a great appreciation for what we do in that transformation. One of the things that I often think about, and maybe it's because I was trained a certain way. I was trained to have an open mind. I was trained to think innovatively. I was trained to think in a sustainable way. I was trained to think multi-generationally because of my people. We often do regional master plans for Indigenous nations. You look at different Indigenous nations and the entire region around them. You look at the electrification, you look at the needs, you look at the mining, and then we work with the nation and we stop and we say, now what do you see? That's a rethinking. That's not a following. It's a total rethinking of what we can do. And I'm often inspired by my own people in their rethinking of clean energy, rethinking of electrification, their rethinking of distribution and transmission. When a mining company is looking at particular electrification needs, sometimes it's the First Nations who say, let's rethink this altogether. Why don't we rethink it by looking at what kind of clean energy projects there are, what kind of innovation and technology we can bring, and sometimes that rethinking of the opportunity. And why wouldn't the Indigenous nation own the asset and sign a PPA with the mining company instead? Very secure revenue for Indigenous nations. An opportunity to own something is an opportunity to recreate the system. And I don't try to not allow myself to lose my innovative thinking in this way. I allow myself to continue to be a free thinker. There is access to funds now. And it's funny to think about Indigenous people as not having the access to funds. And this is a misnomer that constantly comes up in my work. Well, how is the Indigenous nation going to pay for it? Energy is one of the most stable, reliable assets. We have the Canada Infrastructure Bank that has a unique perspective on Indigenous ownership. The top 5 banks all have Indigenous banking, are all interested in being partners with Indigenous nations. Not all nations are interested in being partners with us. But for those that are rethinking their traditional territories, their reserves lands, that is where we can bring that innovative thinking from the private sector and be a catalyst for the change. I sit on a junior mining committee within the Ring of Fire. I take a moment to breathe when I think of that. Because, I had to really, really think about that. Is that something I wanted to do? Is that something I want to participate in? I challenge myself as a woman, as a mother, as an Indigenous, to be a person of change. And I could have shied away from the challenge. But that's not my life, or else I wouldn't be the first person to not go to residential school in my family. Right? I was inspired by 2, communities that chose to be lead for the environmental assessment for the Ring of Fire. And it's interesting because I think a lot of times, we would think First Nations as being people of engagement activities, not leaders of the environmental assessment as proponents. It's a transformation in our thinking. And those two communities, Webequie First Nations and Martin Falls First Nations, have chosen to put their imprint on the environmental assessment, their vision of stewardship, their vision of development. They've chosen to lead that for that entire region. You know, those are not easy challenges. Those are very complex challenges that impact a lot of people. And I often think about that, but, you know, we are in a time to rethink those things. We are in a time to challenge ourselves, to not just say, this is the vision and somebody else should do it. This is the time for us to challenge ourselves to say, how are we going to do it within this lifetime? I'm 51 and I hope to retire sometime soon. Or maybe I won't retire, but I'll work part-time until it's my time to go. But I challenge myself to be a part of the change, and not just to be a person on the other side of change. Why isn't somebody else doing it? And I think to myself, a friend of mine actually said to me the other day, my mere participation in the energy sector is a disruption. It's a disruption to the very rooms that I'm in, because I'm often the only Indigenous person. Making decisions, shaping decisions, reshaping regional master plans, making deals and opportunities come alive, and sometimes saying no to opportunities and rethinking it with a clean energy opportunity. It's no longer sufficient to say that the status quo is enough. It's time to say, you know, the good things that are here today and the good minds that are online watching this. How do we use those good minds that the Creator gave us to make the change, to feel hopeful and inspired? I'm not going to look back at my career and think, you know, I did enough time to retire. My children expect more of me. And my community, who sacrificed so much through residential school so that I could be here, so that I could survive, so that my children could be here, expect me to live an honorable life. And, you know, and I often think about that in the work that I do. And I hope to, you know, create a path for other women, for Indigenous people, at the C-suite level to create the change and to be the catalyst. I like those good challenges, and I'm going to embrace that with kindness. But, you know, my kind thinking does not take away from the warrior that I am inside and the sheer focus that I have about the change that I create, along with all the partners around me. Love that, hopeful. I'm going to be that, and in energy. You know, for us today, the energy transformation are not easy challenges, and bringing together the government, both provincially and federally, bringing together the private sector, bringing together innovation and technology, and bringing together the land that all of this will be built on. Indigenous partners could be the catalyst for recreating those things. The catalyst that has access to all of those different partners. I love that. So thank you. So I know I've got my 10 minutes. He's looking at me. Thank you.
Excellent opening presentations, and I'm sure a great opportunity to get the juices flowing for questions. So if anyone has questions, there are cue cards, and they're going to bring the questions up to me. And are you handing them out now? Okay, maybe I'll start with a question while you're doing that, if that's okay. So yesterday's provincial budget, a lot of talk about critical minerals, Ring of Fire, the role critical minerals are going to play in the transition to a green economy, particularly when it comes to batteries and electric vehicles. And I want to ask both of you, but maybe Fiona, I'll start with you on this, is those are sensitive peatlands up there, store a lot of carbon. So when Phil talked about, land use planning as well as technology and innovation, and obviously Indigenous lands as well. And so what are the key elements of Ontario getting this right? From how do we critical minerals, how do we protect the peatlands, and how do we advance reconciliation and ensure Indigenous true partnerships in the development of the Ring of Fire? What do you think are the key elements of doing that?
That's like 4 questions.
I know, but I'm giving people lots of time to write their questions here.
Well, I think, from my perspective, when I look at Ring of Fire, I think there was a critical change when the First Nations decided to be lead proponents. And there was a transformation when we went from, cliffs to Noron to First Nations led. First Nations co-management of the environment and the environmental stewardship. The First Nations, they're looking at different models around co-management. The Northwest Territories actually has a very good co-management model. And in fact, the First Nations in the Ring of Fire were recently visiting together around the co-management style. So I think there's multiple different steps within the province, within the feds, from a private sector, and then from minerals, to understand that for the most part, First Nations don't own the mines. So their participation in the critical mineral strategy is rather limited in that particular component, when you understand that we don't actually own the mines. But we can own the critical infrastructure surrounding many of the mines moving forward. And I think that that's the undertaking of is their participation in ownership, around participation around infrastructure ownership, participation around the environment, new models for co-development, and truly with the federal government's involvement, because a lot of First Nations land is Crown land. It is not provincial. It really will take multiple stakeholders to see that evolve forward. And there are currently 7 environmental assessments going on. And how do you undertake 7 environmental assessments when you're a small Indigenous nation? I think that there's a key factor for the federal government and provincial government, their role in streamlining the environmental assessment that will ultimately allow for the First Nations and the lead proponents for the Ring of Fire to participate in a quality way instead of a volume way. And we'll look at their true concerns, opponents for that area. And I think as a First Nations person myself, we don't have a veto, but we do have the land. And, development will not happen without a partnership with First Nations. And I say that because we also tend to be 1/3 of the workforce of mines, own all the infrastructure around there. We tend to be involved in the environmental assessment. There isn't a component that we aren't involved in. And so truly, mine development will not happen without us. And that's where our approach to creating the good opportunity to collaborate together is what will make successful, stable, long-term partnerships.
Great, thank you for that.
And Mike, we have a
Brad,
lot of
yeah.
questions, so I'll just really...
No, I'm just going to say, but Brad, I think you have an important perspective here. You've been a minister, and now you're on the outside looking in a bit, and so what would be your response?
Well, it gives me comfort to know that nothing will happen unless it's Indigenous driven. That gives me comfort. I feel that gives me assurance that it will be done right with generation 7, thinking 7 generations ahead, unlike what has been done in mining for a long, long time. What also gives me some level of optimism, we were just at the PDAC. PDAC, for those that don't know, biggest mining conference in the world, held here in Toronto every year. There's a difference between this year and last year at PDAC. The companies, and we do business with some of these companies, they are all aggressively moving to decarbonized technologies. They don't know how they're going to do it yet, but they're going to do it. So I think that the mining companies know that it's not just Ring of Fire, it's everywhere. That if they're going to keep minerals out of the ground, that they're going to have to do it in a decarbonized way. Challenge? A lot of them don't have the capacity we don't have the capacity in our energy system in some of these areas to be able to power those mines if they move to electrify their technology. So that's what I talked about earlier. That's what we have to make sure we get on, is that we have a power system that can help Indigenous communities do the infrastructure and help do this development in a responsible way.
So I'm going to go over I'm going to combine a couple questions, and we'll stick on Indigenous issues for a second. So one question around, will Indigenous ownership require resolutions around treaty claims? And another question sort of related to that is, how can we think about the duty to consult as both a constitutional duty, but also the broader societal obligations?
So questions. I don't think that we can think that there won't be an impact around land claims to what we do in our partnership with Canada. I think that as Indigenous nations, there are unresolved land issues. There are outstanding land claims, and it can't help but be a part of the component of discussion. I can't help but be in energy and talk about residential schools. That's the duality of the history that we are entwined together in Canada. And so I definitely think land claims will be an impact. There are many nations who actually have and can work in parallel on multiple issues, like many of us do. I don't think there is any one issue that holds us back. We can work on multiple issues. I truly believe that at the root of what we're trying to do is having a good relationship. Being a good partner is all about our lives. Being a good partner in marriage, being a good partner, being a good partner in communities, being a good partner with our neighbors. Being a good partner is a part of our life. And in the ecosystem that First Nations are in, being a good corporate partner is just as important. And we're not going to choose to partner with everybody. So those that align with the values that we have, the vision that we're bringing, with the outcomes that we're looking for, those are the partners we're looking for. And I think that that happens for Canadians all the time. And all we're doing is utilizing that good model, that we want to work with good people. And we know who those good corporate partners are. You can't hide who you are. And so we're learning quickly about who are the right partners. And when you build projects together, and you do it well and successfully, and you treat people well, that one project will follow you to the next project, to the next project, to the next project. And so I do believe we can work on projects and work on land claims. There will be some communities who feel strongly that their land claims should come first. And to be quite frank, I feel very respectful of that. I am not a person to tell a nation what their priorities should be. I'm a person that should honor that nation and respect it. And partners that are also trying to do the positive things that I'm trying to do together. And when the land claims become settled and they choose to move forward, then respectfully be a part of that relationship. So as far as the land claims question, that's a complex issue, but I feel strongly that of the over 360 nations of Canada, I'm not one to tell another nation how they should conduct themselves.
Yeah.
Let me just touch briefly on duty to consult. I was Indigenous minister back in the day when mining companies felt like if the law was on their side, that's all they needed. We've consulted, we've held a meeting, that's all we need to do. We'll write a check to the community. We'll maybe have if they're lucky, have a decent impact benefit agreement. But we've got law on our side so we can develop. Well, that only works as well as the community decides that you're going to develop. At the end of the day, we can talk about consent or not consent in a legal way. First Nation communities have the ability to allow a development to go forward. I'll give you an example. Donnie Morris, chief of KI back in the day, he would simply drive his motorboat under the float plane and not allow them to float, not allow them to land. If you can't land your float plane, you can't get going on your development. And he virtually would do that. He'd end up in jail and he'd end up out, and eventually they got their way. Things have changed. Companies are slowly getting around to the fact that, yes, there's a duty to consult, but if that's what you're focused on, you're not going to be successful. You got to be focused on building that relationship, understanding what your partner, your true partner, has gone through and what their aspirations are, and how can you as a partner work with them to mutually aspire together. If you can get there, you'll be successful. If you don't get there and you're focused on just duty to consult, of course there's a duty to consult, but it's got to go well beyond that. And if you can get there, and if you can get there in partnerships, and if you can bring equity into the equation, then you have two partners who are equals that have an interest in the outcome. And that's when you, from a business perspective, de-risk your project, which is good, has to be de-risked, but it's also where you do really great things together that benefit the community and benefit the business.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to add that, there are models already happening across the country in this very topic. I really love what the Tahltan Nation out of northern British Columbia, I really love their approach. They identified their own aspirations for their own nation, created the internal governance and framework for what they were looking for around land use and land use management, and then shared it with the mining companies. And there were some mining companies that they said, no, we're not interested in your partnership. There were some mining companies that they said, yes, you meet what we're looking for in the framework that we've developed for our own people. And ultimately, I think they made a $5 investment in Skeena Resources, one of the mining companies, and decided to purchase and not just become co-managers of the land around them and the infrastructure, but decided that in partnership together, they would work together. And I find that model to be a good model, a First Nations driven model, where they looked at their own lands and their own nation first before they even looked at regional development. And I do find kind of the duty to consult or any kind of veto responses to be very legal in its approach, and certainly can delay, deter our progress together when in fact we could be partners.
Right.
And it's time for us to make that shift and respect the nations that choose not to be partners.
Right, well said. The moderator has a request. Please write legibly. It makes it very challenging. And I say this as someone who always failed in school. My marks were all down because my handwriting wasn't very legible, but it would be helpful. So I'm going to combine a couple questions again because I think they're related. So do we have a good report around the energy needs, especially for the EV transition? And is there a plan to meet those needs? And then related to that, I think, is just what are the alternatives in terms of, I'm going to rephrase this a little bit, scaling up energy generation to meet the demand for electric vehicles? Do you want to start, Brad?
There's a lot to unpack there. Let me say, we're not where we need to be in terms of our planning, but there is hope. There's technology out there there's not one magic wand solution. We can make our system smarter. There's technology available that can make our system smarter. we've got to do a better job of embracing innovation within the structure of our power system. Right now, it's really hard to get innovation into the equation when a company, in the way we build now, you get approval from the Ontario Energy Board. Everybody's trying, they're doing good work. It's all well-meaning. But you're there to build on time, on or under budget. Innovation that can help improve your operating and your ability to be able to get more juice through the current system. There's no incentive for within our system for companies and projects to include that unless they just want to. So there's a lot that can be done on that in that respect. We can get more out of our current system, no question. Storage is moving leaps and bounds now, which is opening up the opportunities for those intermittent renewables that were a real challenge to be able to put into to dispatch into the system and allow for reliable flow of power. Storage is allowing that to happen. On the nuclear side, there's some interesting things happening in Ontario. OPG is one of the first in the world that's looking at small modular reactors, looking at it in a couple of different ways. So that could be a solution down the road. And again, that's a whole discussion for debate as to whether that's the right way to go. But it's certainly something that can't be ignored. So there's a lot going on out there. We can get there, but we're going to have to start charting the course today.
Absolutely, and you know what, to kind of add to Brad's comments, we already see what electrification looks like in the province. This is all open for us to see through the IESO, through OPG, through Bruce Power, through the Ontario Energy Board. We already know where the province is planning for us. It's, how do we recognize what we've planned and how we can add to that? And how do we participate, whether it's from the private sector, whether it's in innovation and technology. Innovation and technology is going to drive us into the future. And, that has been difficult to integrate. We've been challenged by not making some key and critical decisions that did need to be made, and now we're here. And so, for those of us in the sector, we already see where the roadmap is going. And the gap between the roadmap and where we need to be or where we want to be. I would say it's where we want to be and need to be, but are we actually making those critical decisions to really build the foundation to achieve that?
Great, thank you. I think Tom wanted to, Tom, we're gonna let you ask your question in the mic if you want.
Well, thank you. And so many questions one could ask of the panel. I should tell you, Fiona, that Nathalie and I have already agreed that next September 20th, we're having a policy probe on water, where one of the main questions is going to be how can we work with Indigenous leaders, not to consult, but to jointly redraft the Canada Water Act for the 21st century. So that's another step up, ownership of a policy process. But Brad, you mentioned electricity, electrical distribution, and potential Ontario energy shortages. Our first keynote speaker spoke about electricity greatly. So my question is, I'm from Winnipeg, and both Quebec and Manitoba have made hydro expansion the centerpiece, really, of their economic strategies. So is there a case to be made? It's always surprised me that Ontario has not used the hydro resources of its neighboring provinces in a major way, since they've already committed the capital. So is there a case to be made that we should have regional electricity grids or a national electricity grid to begin as part of the solution to the electrical problems that both you and our keynote highlighted?
The answer is yes, and it's a dialogue that's been ongoing, as you know, Tom, for a very long time, since long before Dwight Duncan was even minister, when we were talking about importing power from Manitoba. And we have made some of the infrastructure investments, the east-west tie and others, to build that transmission system that was to do some of that. It's often been cited that we should be importing more power from Quebec, and we would like to. But we're not going to import more power from Quebec if the price is more than it's going to cost us to produce it here. We also have to be careful because Quebec has their own energy challenges, and sometimes when they need their power, we need their power as well. So they don't have the excess power when we need it. So it's a lot more complicated than I thought it would be. When I became minister, I asked the same question. Oh, why are we building all this? Why don't we just bring the power in from Quebec? It's clean, blah, blah, blah. And it's just not that simple. And we could never get to an agreement with Quebec, despite best efforts, where we could get a reliable cost price that would actually be the best business case for us. I mean, 60% of the power that we use comes from nuclear here. I would argue that's actually, we've been probably one of the best jurisdictions in the world to take advantage of that. We can debate the nuclear field. That gets a lot of interesting discussion. And there are opportunities to continue to enhance our own hydropower. We've done that in Niagara Falls. We've invested in the Niagara Tunnel. That's providing clean, renewable power for us. Monogamy Dam up Hearst area, Ontario Power Generation, probably the first true Indigenous partnership that I know of in our power system with the Moose Cree First Nation and OPG that made that happen. So we have some of it. There's still more, but it all comes down to distance, where it's located. We don't have the natural benefits that Quebec and Manitoba have to make it as easy for Ontario to produce as much of our own hydro. Niagara Falls notwithstanding. It's a pretty good resource.
Okay.
We have a written question that asked that question but had a second question. Importance, I want to ask that. So they talked about the federal budget having a east-west grid, but also how can Canada accelerate the development of hydrogen fuels without getting locked into using fossil gas to generate it? Any thoughts, either one of you? Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, Fiona mentioned John Risley.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I worked for John when I left Pulse initially. I worked directly with him for a couple of years, and he's got some vision for using offshore wind to generate hydrogen, and it really looks promising. I hope it is for his sake, but it really looks promising. And again, there's Indigenous partnerships involved in that heavily as well. So hydrogen, I remember my days as economic minister traveling over to the auto shows around the world and to Japan, where Toyota and Honda often were seen as global leaders. Mm-hmm. Germany. There was a lot of those companies felt hydrogen was going to be the solution. Mm-hmm. And I think now, and a lot of us back then, we didn't know. I think it's becoming pretty obvious that that's going to be one of the solutions for sure.
Yeah, some people said, some people have argued Toyota put too much into hydrogen and not enough into electrification of their vehicles, but that may switch at some point soon, eh?
Putting all our eggs in one basket when we don't really know the future might be a little bit risky. Yeah.
Did you want anything on that?
I think like the World Energy Project in the Maritimes is a great vision for the future, and I think that John and his partners looking at offshore as opposed to what we're doing on land. And hydrogen has been such a key point of discussion in Ontario. You're looking at the Niagara region and the upcoming hydrogen project there. Participation, there is no going to be one place. And I think that that's, speaks to Brad's point. It's going to have to be multiple different opportunities that come together to create the change that we're actually looking for.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll go to one of you.
The issue of hydroelectricity was being discussed. I suspect we've all seen images from the crisis in the Colorado River system. I was wondering if you could comment on any knock-on effects you foresee from that, the disruption to the hydroelectric infrastructure in the North American West, and more generally perhaps comment on climate change impacts on hydroelectricity and how that's relevant to this discussion.
Thank you.
Great question. I'll be honest with you, I haven't given that too much thought. My son was just out, he's a construction engineer building the Site C Dam out in British Columbia. So I've always seen it as a solution, but it's not the solution. I mean, hydro projects are not unimpactful to the environment either. I mean, we go into pristine, beautiful areas and by and large disrupt them. There's lots of technology and lots of efforts made to return them to their natural state, but I don't know that we ever fully get there. So I see it as one of the tools, but as I mentioned 8 areas where we need to focus on. We need to focus on renewables for sure. There's no question, but there are a lot of different options for us to look at in that area. And a lot of new technologies being developed. Our challenge is, though, we can't say, well, let's wait till the new technology is developed and proven, and then we'll choose our path. Because if we're not choosing our path, I would say like 3 years ago, when we probably should have been starting to, or even longer, we're not going to be there in time. And when all those folks decide that range anxiety has left them, and they can afford electric vehicles, and we have a charging infrastructure in place to allow them to do that, and they go to plug in and there's not enough power to meet demand at that point in the day, that's not a place I want to be. So I think we have to be very practical in looking at what's available today to get us to that point where, and pick your date. When is this big onslaught of electric vehicles going to happen? Is it going to be 2035? I think it'll be sooner. For sure. I think the manufacturers are ready. I think the regulations are there. The infrastructure's not. The charging infrastructure, no power yet. Well, time to get on with it.
I also think that was a great question. I tend to agree with Brad. Once there's been a disruption to the land, I don't know that we ever go back. And that's just, I'm a practical person. I'm a practical person that also, looks at design and build. Perspective is, I accept the fact that there's already a disruption, and that's already here. One of the things that I'm also thoughtful about is, those that, own the power assets are also looking at the structural changes to upgrade those assets into something else. Assets to, hydrogen, assets to look at new technology. What do you do once you've disrupted the land? And it's not going back. And I'm thoughtful about that because, many partners that we have at Cormorant are actually living through that disruption and are looking for potential solutions once that asset is there. And, they're coming towards the end time of that asset, or there's new technologies available to look at a change of that asset. So I just, I accept the fact in the work that I do that the disruption is already here. And I don't know that we can ever go back. But what do we do once it's here? Is something that I'm thoughtful of, and I think that change will happen. We'll ask ourselves that question again and again and again over the lifetime of that asset that's usually multi-generational.
So I was going to say on the electric vehicle infrastructure, as the person who's charging at the only charger I can find within a 1-block radius of this location, it's not even enough electricity, it's enough chargers for those of us. So anyone else looking for a charging station, have it. This question is a bit hard to read, but I hope I'm going to get it right. It was just talking about the other night on TV, I'm assuming on TVO because it references Steve Paikin. I was talking about the great potential in the Ring of Fire, and was saying that some First Nations are on side and some First Nations are not on side. And how do you reconcile those competing, that conflict? Yeah.
Such a good question, because I think that that's a question that's happening all over the country. That's not just happening in the Ring of Fire. That's happening for the European Union. And it would be easy to say, why can't everybody just get along, open up the borders, have one currency, and be fine? That's unrealistic for Canadians. It's unrealistic for the European Union. It's unrealistic to think that we would have that easy transition as well. With diverging interests of the 7 impacted First Nations, two have chosen to be proponents on behalf of First Nations issues, initiatives, rights, and environment. I also respect, though, that there are land claims happening within that territory. And, the First Nations are looking at, how the federal government can also resolve this outstanding issue. This is also timely. I think that First Nations have been patient. And how patient should we be? This is a constant balance in the question. But I don't think that we're going to get to, 7 communities coming on board, the mining company being ready, the provincial government being ready, the federal government being ready, and the 7 environmental assessments, unless we actually take a comprehensive and holistic approach to the outstanding issues that First Nations are bringing to the forefront. And these are not unreasonable issues. These are not unreasonable requests. It is the time. And so, I do believe that we will arrive. I think that it's the approach that we take to arrive, though. The approach can add on a decade, or the approach integrate a comprehensive vision to understanding the actual vision of the First Nations for that region, and how to address that, and then in partnership, how to mitigate certain issues from a private sector perspective, from a government perspective, and from a First Nations perspective, all of us. And the Ring of Fire can become an economic engine for the country, for Ontario. And so, we're not without thoughtfulness about what that can mean. But I do believe that there's good outstanding issues. And it's timely to address them.
It's always amazed me, I'm just going to jump in, but it's always amazed me how Canadians, with our historic experiences, how we can look at 17 First Nation communities or 13 First Nation communities in a region and say, oh, I can't believe they can't reach consensus and all get along. Like, have you seen a First Ministers Conference in Canada? Have you ever seen everybody getting along across Canada? But
you ever been to question period?
but do we actually eventually get to a point where we come to a consensus and move forward? First Nations are exactly the same, and we have a shining example of that in Wataynikaneyap Powers. 17 First Nations, right? 17. Watay.
24 communities.
24 communities. Now, they didn't all, and they still don't all get along. Most do. There was 2 that held out right to the very end. They were being strategic. Well, tell me that doesn't happen in Canada, where provinces hold out to the end to try to just get a little more from the federal government. So, I see that as, I don't want to say it's not our problem, but I often look at that and I'll say to companies, look, that's not your problem. That's First Nations that will get themselves organized and get together, because they'll know it'll be in their interest ultimately, and they'll do it on their timing.
Great.
And for those here that don't know what Watay is, Wataynikaneyap Power is 1,700 kilometers of transmission line and 22 substations, owned in partnership with those 24 communities as majority owners, with a minority ownership by Fortis. And the 24 First Nations communities have a vision in 25 years to be 100% Indigenous owned. And you can see the sheer volume of their undertaking and their successful undertaking and their ability and the platform that they have developed to become in fact impactful in the North and to service the opportunities around electrification in the north. And in fact, Cormorant Utility is the O&M provider to Wataynikaneyap Power, and I'm the executive lead on behalf of the company for that project.
Great. Did you want to ask a question?
She just answered my
You just
question.
oh, perfect. Okay, great.
I
Okay.
did have a couple of thoughts. Like, it takes about 10 years to, just build a nuclear plant, and about 20 years to establish an electricity grid. And with the recent announcement of IPCC that we are most likely to hit 1.5 degree and above by 2030, and with so much of climate change, my worry is how will this infrastructure sustain? Right now we are thinking 2035, and also solar panels, they're likely to generate about 1 million tons of waste by 2035. And I understand in the priority waste generation, waste management is probably 5th or 6th ranking, but I guess my worry is are we really ahead in terms holistically when it comes to how will we tackle the next issue? Because I feel we get fixated on electrification or hydrogen or energy, and it's just it's still very short-sighted.
Great question. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think you've just made
Yeah.
the case for
Yeah.
why jurisdictions need to have long-term energy plans. The mix is the mix, and there's all kinds of things that will go into that. And I could have my view as to what the mix should be of our power generating sources. And we probably, none of us, will all have different views of that. At the end of the day, though, we need enough power to meet demand. So we need to come up with some form of mix that's reliable, that's as affordable as possible, understanding the fact it's going to cost, and that's clean. That's got to be the goal. And I'm confident we can get there if we have the political will to do it.
Also, I think, sorry, just to add to it, electricity storage is one of the biggest challenges, because
Yeah.
we can build those batteries. For instance, a lot of Asian countries have inverters in their home that you can charge when you have the electricity, and then they kind of give you the electricity when there is no electricity. But I feel Canada, because of their existing very strong electricity system, we don't have those backups right now, so I think electricity storage would be another thing to think about.
100% correct.
So I don't think that we're taking that holistic vision right now. And I think it's okay to say that. It's just something that we see in front of us. And there will be no one lead for that holistic vision. But I do think that we are starting to make a shift. And I can see that shift. Even within my lifetime, I can see that shift coming. And there are practical milestones that we are starting to achieve, but it truly will take multiple stakeholders to create and implement that vision, and all of us really making a decision. And that's kind of the biggest thing. Is it's not not just politicians, as I'm sitting between them, but I politely say that. But it's making a decision.
Yeah.
When we make a decision to do something, we execute on that. When we don't make that decision, we await somebody else to make that decision for us. I am seeing small changes around the battery storage that you're talking about, even residential battery storage, utility scale battery storage here in the province, and then large scale battery storage like Ornada, and I think even things like Agnico Eagle, and from a private sector mining perspective around battery storage in some of the remote areas. So we are making that shift, but I don't believe that that's a holistic vision that we're taking to the grid.
Your comment about policy is a great segue into the final question, which I've held to the last, and we only have 3 minutes. So climate change effects seem to be missing from how the Ontario government is developing policy. How can we as citizens encourage a greater climate frame on government policy and urge more urgent action?
That sounds like your next question.
I know, that's why I saved
You're
it
going
for
to be
the
asking
last.
that.
I'm like, who wrote this for me? Do you want to help me write questions? Yeah, catch me afterwards, and you can help volunteer to write questions for me.
My question was legible.
And it was legible.
I'm no longer a practicing politician, so Yeah, I'm going to forego the opportunity to jump on the government, because I'm going to leave that to you, Mike.
Okay.
But I think it's got to be part of any vision. It's got to be part of any vision for anything, not just energy, for anything now. And I would have said 5 years ago that on the private sector side, it's not happening. The mindset's not there. It's been usual. I think there's been a real transformation, and it's probably, some of it's been board-led, some of it's been ESG-led. It may not be going as fast as it should. A lot of it's investor-led. If you want to open a new mine now somewhere in the world, it's hard to get the investment money to start off with. A lot of that money is now tied to ESG goals. So the incentives are there now, and I'm seeing some pretty good transformation in the private sector. And I think that no matter who's in office, if they're putting a long-term energy plan in place to address some of these issues we're trying to get to, that's going to be front and center. If you were doing it, it might be more front and center than if somebody else was.
Sure. Fiona, did you want to add to that? Final comment?
Final comment would be that I think you're right, Brad, in the way that from a private sector perspective, it's investor-led. And that's truly when the change starts to take root. From a government perspective, we're going to have good public policy, but good public policy is also driven by people who participate in creating that. People who believe in it and running on that platform. People actually voting and participating in voting. And I say that gently because as an Indigenous person, I even am thoughtful about voting.
Right.
But truly, as you invest in shaping the country, each of us have the opportunity to make that change. And I believe in that personal component to making that change. So investor-led, activist investors, and those that choose to, and then those that choose to try to be elected and to run on solid platforms that create a vision for Canada that we embrace.
Great. Well, thank you. Can we give a big round of applause? Excellent panel.
He said we're going to do that.
Round of applause. Perfect. And shout out to the students for bringing us together, because this was an informative, fantastic discussion. And I think we're moving to break now. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much to our great moderator, MPP Mike Schreiner, again, and our fantastic panelists, Brad Dogood and Fiona Blondin. Such a fantastic start after a great keynote. Everyone can now stretch their leg. We're going to go back to where the coffee and snacks were in the morning for a little break. We'll go over there for like 25 minutes or so, and then we'll come back for panel 2. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good work, everyone.